Dear brothers and sisters, I hope that you can hear me and I hope that you can understand my accent. As Father Anderson said, yes, I'm from Fort Worth, Diocese of Fort Worth. I grew up in West Texas, so if you hear a little twang, that's where that comes from. But I'm happy to be with you all, and I apologize for bringing the heat up here with me. Maybe it'll get better next week when I leave, but we'll have to we'll just sweat a little bit, you know? We'll drink some water and we'll sweat a little more. That's how it goes. Well, the theme of this week is the Church in Revolution, as Father Anderson mentioned. And I first of all think it's funny that we call revolutions by this name in particular, because after all, a revolution happens when one body revolves all the way around another body and ends up exactly where it started. What we really intend to mean by revolution is that it's something where a large change has occurred, but this word revolution unintentionally carries with it so much irony and actually honesty when we think about its true meaning, to return right back where it started. In fact, the French have a phrase that you know in English. It's le plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. The more things change, the more they stay the same. We've all heard that phrase also by the historian George Santayana: those who do not learn history are doomed to repeat it. Or simply that briefer corollary, history repeats itself. For a more ecclesial audience, we might turn to the book of Ecclesiastes, where you see that repeated phrase, there's nothing new under the sun. Indeed, the events of history tend to come back around time and again with different circumstances, but with new outcomes. We may think that we are living through a revolution right now, in the church, in our country, or in the world. And we don't yet have the perspective to say for sure right now whether that's true. But what we do know is that we've been here before, and we will be here again. For the time being, we can look back into the somewhat recent past and try to glean some lessons from a time when things looked a little similar to our present situation. It's not going to be all gloom and doom. There's going to be some of that, but it's not all that way, because I'm not going to be a prophet of doom here. I want to instill a little bit of hope for our church. Hopefully we can learn some of the lessons of the past, most notably from one saint in particular who was produced in this chapter of history. My talk is on the French Revolution, and specifically, what are some of the dynamics of the church during that time? And I was interested in this topic mostly because of this moniker that France has. You know it, that she's the eldest daughter of the church. And yet we see in France today, in the 21st century, a decadence and a loss of faith that has pervaded all of Western civilization. So is this de-Christianization of this eldest daughter of the church, is this traceable to the revolution? I think in part, yes. And it still has ripple effects that endure to today. I will explore what was going on in the hierarchy as well as among the laity at the time. What was it like for your average Catholic in France during the Revolution? Did some defect to the cause of the Revolution? Most certainly. Did some remain loyal to the king and to the church? Most certainly. Did many give their lives for one side or the other? Absolutely. Then how was one expected to keep the faith with the whole social order falling down around them? This question may not seem so dissimilar to the questions we're asking ourselves today. I've had the privilege of visiting the city of Portland once before, and my last visit, I was charmed by her quirks and, let's say, charmed by her more eccentric citizens. At least they seem eccentric to me. I don't know how they seem to y'all, but I'm from Texas, where cultural conformity is more the order of the day. So I was pleased to visit here before, and I have friends here. It has been sad to me what has happened here in the past year and a half. The social unrest that we've seen on the news so often, it's easier for an outsider to think that the whole city was being dismantled without one brick standing on top of another. On TV, it looks like a revolution. But where is it going? And where does it end? Well, I hope that we can take for granted that we have the following goals in common, that we want to live in peace. We want our neighbors and ourselves to be virtuous. We want a place to live where the law of love is written on our hearts and that governs us personally and at every level of society. But even the French revolutionaries wanted the same. At least they wanted their version of it. Many of us already know what led up to the revolution and how it ended, so I'm just going to go over some of the major events, highlighting along the way the ways that the church was affected and injecting some of my own commentary. Leading up to the war, 1756 to 1763. For context, this is just before the American Declaration of Independence. There was the 7 Years' War, and in American history, that was called the French and Indian War. It was a long war, it was 7 years long, in fact, between France and Great Britain. It was financially devastating for France. For the next 20 plus years, France would desperately try to gain control of her flagging economy. A series of financial ministers had different opinions on the policies to enact, with price fixing of grain and exporting of grain, partially just to get some revenge on their old enemy, Britain. France helped the United States defeat Britain in our very own revolution, you'll recall. Yet this action only worsened France's debts. In the 1780s, the weather played a role in history, for a series of meager harvests and finally a completely failed harvest created near famine conditions. There was nothing to eat. At the same time, throughout that century, it was the Age of Enlightenment, and writers such as Voltaire and Rousseau, Montesquieu and Locke were having great influence on political philosophy, and more people were being exposed to it because more of the populace was becoming literate. And by the way, the church deserves a lot of credit for that, because her schools and religious orders played a large role in making sure the subjects of France could read. By 1787, I have a typo. France was bankrupt. And they tried to find a solution by convoking an assembly of notables. This was basically a VIP club, just to come up with a solution. Maybe we can fix the problem. But they didn't. The population was getting increasingly restless and increasingly hungry. So it was thought that the only solution to fixing the financial problems was to convoke the Estates General. This was an advisory body that hadn't been assembled for 175 years. It was not legislative, it was merely advisory. Think of it as a medieval parish council on steroids. It was set up in 3 tiers: the first estate, the clergy; the second estate, the nobility; and the third estate, everybody else. When passing resolutions in this council, each estate got 1 vote. And so the clergy and nobility tended to vote together, leaving the third estate always in the minority, at least by votes. In terms of representation, the first 2 estates represented 500,000 Frenchmen, while the third estate represented 27 million. It's very lopsided for us who think of representation. We've all heard about the lavish spending habits of King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, so there's little other to say here than there was a growing envy and a resentment among the lower class. It could be said that the Kingdom of France was already running on fumes, and then in 1789, the wheels came off the wagon. The third estate had had enough of being outvoted in the Estates General, and so they convened in a separate building along with a few clergy and noblemen who had joined their cause. They called themselves the National Assembly, and they declared sovereignty over the nation. They raided the Bastille for weapons. They passed laws abolishing feudalism, privileges, and hereditary offices, and in effect abolished the monarchy. On August 4th of that year, the government abolished the tithe. That was the church tax. That was the main source of revenue for the clergy. Without that, the church had no source of income. August 4th, incidentally, would become the future feast day of St. John Vianney, who we'll celebrate in a couple of days. At that time, when that church tithe was abolished, he was a mere 3 years old, for context. The revolutionaries had hoped that taking the church's lands and riches would help to pay their debts, because after all, there's no more king anymore, so why should I have to pay my taxes? And they stopped paying their taxes, so they had to find another source of income. They sought to make the clergy dependent on the state so that they could be brought under control. There was a movement to turn the clergy into an elected position, where the government would appoint a bishop and merely just notify Rome whom they had chosen. And we see a very similar thing happening in China today. The National Assembly created their version of the Bill of Rights called the Declaration of Rights of Man and of the Citizen. And in this declaration, which predates our own American Bill of Rights by a few years, the philosophies of Locke and Rousseau had their greatest influence. Thomas Jefferson also had a hand in writing these. They look somewhat similar to our own Bill of Rights, but they fundamentally misunderstand the nature of liberty. Article 4 in the Declaration states, "Political liberty consists in the power of doing whatever does not injure another." This is not the idea of Christian liberty that St. Augustine once wrote about, and St. Thomas Aquinas expanded on. Christian liberty is the ability to gain virtue, to have a facility in doing the right and doing the good, to have a certain ease at doing what is good. It is not license. That is the ability to do whatever I want, unless it harms somebody else. Lest you think that this is a 21st century problem, it began long before our time. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen effectively ended the traditional relationship between church and state. Because up to that point, the Catholic Church and the Kingdom of France were synonymous. The Catholic Church was now to be seen as just one faith among many. Church was viewed as a subset of the nation, rather than one nation, a subset of the larger church. By the end of 1789, all the church's property had been assumed by the state. It's estimated that the church owned about 1/10 of the property in France, and now it owned nothing. The next year, monasteries were closed, and monastic vows were forbidden. Monks and nuns could either leave their religious orders with a state pension paid to them, or they could be regrouped into smaller retirement homes, but they couldn't practice their monastic vows. The number of clergy, too, was severely reduced, and they were now to be paid by the state, meaning the state had control over them. Up to this point, the National Assembly was not trying to abolish the church, for even Enlightenment thinkers and the deputies of the Third Estate conceded that the church had a role in society. However, they thought that role was merely pragmatic, something that was useful to them. They believed that the church existed to promote happiness and maintain order through a moral code and the promotion of self-improvement. As long as the church was full of Oprahs and Joel Osteens, she could stay. But the assembly had no respect for the sacerdotal and propitiatory functions of the priest. In their eyes, the priest was there just to make sure the kids played nicely. The revolutionaries regarded some form of cult to be essential to society, but they had defunded the church and persecuted her clergy. Therefore, it became necessary to replace Catholicism with something else. At first, God became known as the Supreme Being. Well, that's not altogether untrue. It was the first step in depersonalizing God. And that led to the worship of abstract concepts, such as the cult of reason. And that ended with a repersonification of reason in the form of a goddess, and her statue sat in the sanctuary of Notre Dame de Paris. From the revolutionaries' perspective, they had the best of intentions. They wanted a virtuous citizenry, but they rejected divine revelation. They believed they could create a just and virtuous society without all that so-called Christian mythology. They wanted a society without hierarchies, without traditional authority. They thought they could tear the skeleton out of the body and the body would keep its shape. The horrors that came next would prove their project an impossibility. It's reminiscent of what we would call virtue signaling today, because we want the appearance of virtue, but we don't want to work for it. We just want to change our avatar on our Twitter and look everybody how virtuous I am. We want the results of a Christian society, we want the trappings of its morality, but we don't want the discipline of Christianity. No, thank you. It is true that we have to have virtue for society to hold together, but humanistic virtue that's based on ourselves will ultimately fail. The reality is that our virtue must be built upon our faith in Jesus Christ. That was what the philosophes missed. The replacement of religion turned into a wholesale campaign of de-Christianization, and the towns and cities suffered much more than the countryside. Many Catholics fled to neighboring Italy and Spain and Britain. Priests who did not sign the new oath of fidelity to the Constitution were executed or sent into hiding. The priests who did sign the oath were seen by many of the faithful as cowardly, and a schism threatened to divide the church. Overall, by the numbers, 60% of the pastors signed the oath, 51% of vicar priests signed the oath, and 7 of the 136 bishops signed the oath. And again, there were notable regional patterns. Generally, the area around Paris and Provence and the center part of the country were more of the oath signers of the Constitution. Rather, the refractory priests, that is the rebel priests, who were the more conservative ones, were found mostly in the west of France and in the northwest of France. But that wasn't the only divide. It wasn't just town and country. It wasn't just regionally. There were 2 models of the priesthood before 1789. See if this sounds familiar. On the one hand, you had the Tridentine clergy, obedient, hierarchical, and highly trained, who see themselves as leaders of the laity and who stress the importance of the church as an autonomous institution. And these priests tended to reject the oath. On the other hand, there was the model of the citizen priest, who saw himself as part of the people and understood his social role as promoter of public welfare and happiness. And these priests tended to comply with the revolution and with its oath. These juror priests, as they were called, or oath takers, predominated the areas of de-Christianization in the country, where religion was seen as a matter of general concern, but that the state still had authority over religion. Conversely, the refractory priests, or non-oath takers, were largely supported by their parishioners, who had been formed to see their priests as separate and in a leadership role. The refractory priests did their best to surreptitiously carry on their ministry, oftentimes in secret. In Brittany in particular, the Catholic peasants would move their priests around from house to house during the night, using bird calls to signal to each other when it was safe to move, because those were caught were often executed. I once visited the Champ des Martyrs, the field of martyrs up there near Quiberon, a place where there was a center of uprising against the revolution. This was a truly heroic time for priests and laity alike. The refractory priests didn't wait for Rome to come to their aid. They actively undermined the constitutional priests and what I think was a little bit humorous, they would hold competing services. They would hold masses at the same time as the constitutional priests. They would refuse to hand over the keys to the rectories, and they would hide the chalices, and generally they would call their priesthood into question. So there was a resistance there. In many places, the laity rallied to these refractory priests, calling the state-appointed priest an intruder and refusing to follow him. And women in particular were heroic in defending the old religion. The oath-taking was a wedge issue if there ever was one. Not even the king was exempt from this controversy. Well, on the one hand, he was trying to appease the revolutionaries. On the other hand, he also avoided receiving the sacraments from the constitutional priests. People noticed that, so he tried to escape unsuccessfully to Belgium. The revolution did not stop at setting up their secular religion in opposition to Catholicism. In 1793, they began an active campaign of de-Christianization, though it was carried out unevenly across the nation. Many pockets of resistance cropped up, especially across the west of France. And perhaps the most notable opposition arose in Brittany and in the neighboring Vendée region due to the persecution of priests who refused to sign that oath of obedience. In the Vendée, especially as civil war erupted and the conservative rebels organized into the Catholic and Royal Army against the secularizing revolutionaries. You may have seen some of us priests wearing this symbol on our breast tonight. This is the symbol of the Vendée, this army that fought for God and the King, or rather God the King, Dieu le Roi, against the revolution. Sadly, these faithful Catholics could not mount a sufficient defense, and they were defeated in December of that year. And in the end, 14,000 so-called traitors were sentenced to death in France, half of them from the Vendée. In that same year, the king and Marie Antoinette were executed, and it was announced that terror will be the order of the day. Robespierre was the architect of the reign of terror, and it got so bad that anyone who was even suspected of being against the revolution could find themselves meeting with the national razor. Robespierre was so bloodthirsty that even his own collaborators began to fear a reprisal, and the next year in 1794 they issued a vote of no confidence, and eventually Robespierre himself was executed by the guillotine. With the priesthood in turmoil, faithful Catholics who remained had to take up the practice of their faith into their own hands. Lay leadership started to crop up, popular devotions grew, and even some laymen took it upon themselves to try to celebrate the Mass in what was called a blind Mass or a white Mass, because priests were nowhere to be found. Many French priests had fled with the refugees to other countries. One positive outcome of this was that the Catholic faith would now be more accepted in places like Britain over the coming centuries. The last chapter of the Revolution was largely written by Napoleon Bonaparte. He successfully put down a rebellion in Paris and had a successful campaign against the Austrians, so he rose through the ranks. And as he took charge as the Grand Consul, there was finally a light at the end of the tunnel for Catholics once Napoleon had gained power. Napoleon also viewed the church as an obstacle but a practical necessity. So he didn't go so far as the de-Christianizers in marginalizing the Catholic Church, just so far as long as he was in charge. Now keep in mind what happened with the Pope this whole time. The whole time the Pope was vehemently against the revolution, as were all the other European monarchs. After all, if the King of France could fall, their country might be next. At one point it seemed as though the Pope would not even have a successor when Napoleon marched and took the city of Rome. But eventually, Napoleon came to an agreement, the Concordat of 1801, that he struck with the Pope, Pope Pius VII, which ended with a compromise. The compromise was this: French Catholics would be allowed to reopen their churches and practice their faith, but the church had to recognize that the state kept all the land that it had seized from the church. And that extends even to today. in large part. The church is nowhere near as landed as she was in those days. This wasn't a perfect solution, but it may have saved the Catholic faith in France for a generation just being formed. One such young Frenchman went by the name of Jean-Marie Vianney. As a child, St. John Vianney assisted at Holy Mass, celebrated in secret by a refractory priest, one of those priests who had refused to take the oath to the new Constitution. The priest's prayers were mingled with sobs and tears that night, and the whole scene resembled the masses said by those early Christians in the catacombs of Rome. The reign of terror ramped up when young Jean Vianney was only 7. Churches were closed, the bells were silenced, and even at home the crucifixes and religious articles had to be carefully hidden. Little Jean-Marie did not have the luxury of progressing through a parish sacramental prep program. He didn't make his first confession until the age of 11, when a visiting priest asked him how long it's been since his last confession. He said, "I have never been to confession." And the priest replied, "Let us set right this omission at once." For at least the next 5 years, the revolutionary calendar remained in force, and Sundays were eliminated, wiped off the calendar. Religious celebrations were prohibited, but still continued in secret to some extent. Jean-Marie was 13 when he finally received his first Holy Communion. And by then his hunger and his desire for our Eucharistic Lord had been nurtured by the rich faith of his family, amid the meager means of which he was raised. In his later years, he would teach the young children of his parish about that moment when he received First Holy Communion. The tears would come back to his eyes each and every time he taught the kids about how special it was to receive our Lord's body and blood, soul, and divinity. He would pull out the rosary beads that he received on that day, and he would show them. He never ceased to shed tears when speaking of Holy Communion. His vocation to the priesthood was fostered by much prayer and fasting amid turmoil. On one occasion, he made a pilgrimage of 100 kilometers on foot, carrying no food for the journey, just begging along the way. And that was to confirm his own vocation to the priesthood. At age 20, he was finally confirmed as he began to study for the priesthood. And he took the name of John the Baptist as his confirmation name. In 1815, after his well-known years of academic struggle in the seminary, the pious Abbé Vianney was ordained a priest at the age of 29, because he desired nothing more than to win souls for God. What lessons can we learn from the early years of this blessed saint? How is it possible that a vocation to the priesthood and the formation of this holy man was accomplished in the face of such terror and tumult? Aided by the grace of God, the credit certainly goes to Madame Vianney, who raised her children in a spirit of piety and prayer. We all know the saying, "The hand that rocks the cradle rules the world." It was St. Jean Vianney's mother who laid the foundations of Jean-Marie's faith and set him on the path to sainthood. A mother's diligent efforts to pass on the Catholic faith in time of revolution gained for the Church a heroic witness of Jesus Christ. Certainly, there were countless other children who were taught the Pater Noster on their mother's knees during those chaotic years. For the Catholic Church in Europe, though seriously wounded, did not die and persists to this day. We ought to glean from this episode in church history that the Catholic faith is spread not by mandates from the top down, but is a personal encounter with the resurrected Lord, passed on from believer to believer. We can have parish programs and conferences and diocesan initiatives and papal encyclicals, but the heart of our faith is belief in the Son of God, and that is passed on from one Christian to the next. Popular devotions, home shrines, litanies, prayers, family catechesis have always been part of the Catholic life. And these can never be stamped out by tyrannical governments. This is how the faith survived in time of revolution. We look with hope today to regions in the world experiencing a grassroots spread of Christianity, even in China, despite the secularizing efforts of its atheist communist regime. Christianity is quietly growing. The good news cannot be bottled up forever. Le plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. The more things change, the more they are the same thing. Today's French Revolution, or rather today's study of the French Revolution, parallels today's situation a little bit. What did the revolutionaries do? The revolutionaries upended the pillars of their society, changing the calendar, stirring up class divisions, ferreting out and killing counter-revolutionaries, and engaging in violent protests in their streets. We have seen the same marks of revolution in our country of late. Just in this another parallel, true religion has its hallmarks. We have our sanctoral calendar commemorating our saints. We have a concept of original sin and baptism to wash it away. We have even excommunication as a remedy to bring sinners to repentance. We have reparation for sins through charitable works or pious devotions. Sacraments bring life and fruitfulness to the church. We have monthly devotions, and we have the 7 gifts of the Holy Spirit. Most of all, we have the holy sacrifice of the Mass. But a new secular religion wants to replace each of these things. This secular religion is being cobbled together by various entities, even ones that seem innocuous. When you go to search for something on the internet, that one page that's mostly white with one word at the top, and you type in the search bar, that one, the Google Doodles that change every so often remind you which secular hero you're supposed to commemorate today, changing the calendar. Wokeism demands you to publicly repent of your original sin of racism, even if you didn't personally commit a racist thought or actions. And if you ever have done anything that could be perceived as racist, you get canceled, and that's their form of excommunication. In reparations for your sins against the environment, you can buy indulgences in the form of carbon credits. Marriage has been redefined, and everyone is forced to recognize and applaud the new version, out with the old and with the new. June used to be the month of the Sacred Heart of Jesus. Now it is a celebration of perversion and pride, which is the worst of the 7 deadly sins. The evil sacrifice of unborn children is protected now by law and even celebrated by a disturbed and misled contingent. Le plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. This is not doom and gloom only. The other lessons we glean from the French Revolution is that the faith is passed on by the family. For the gates of netherworld will not overcome the church. Jesus promised it. The family passes on the faith. Regardless of what happens among our leaders, regardless of whether you like your priest or not, or whether you like the music or not, or whether you like the traditional Latin Mass or the ordinary form, the faith is passed on by the family. The faith in Jesus Christ. Courage and heroic witness is needed in every age. Today, whether we are currently at the beginning of a revolution, or in the middle of it, or even at the end, or in between revolutions, only future historians will say for sure. But Jesus Christ is the same, yesterday, today, and forever. Louange à toi, Seigneur Jésus. Laus tibi Christe.